Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. You all are welcome. Following are the audiovisual aids that are used for this lesson: multimedia, pictures, textbook. Objectives are truly based on 5E model and Bloom's taxonomy. At the end of the lesson, students will be able to define the term food chain with 2 examples, differentiate between producers, consumers, and decomposers with at least 1 example, construct a food web by using arrows and pictures correctly. For engagement of students and to check their previous knowledge, following questions will be asked: what is ecosystem? What are biotic and abiotic components of ecosystem? What are herbivores, carnivores, omnivores? How many of you have pets? What's their food? As the cat is a pet and it eats fishes, earthworm, cockroaches. So we know every animal eats another animal, and this process make a chain called food chain. And this is our today's topic: food chain and food web. First of all, we should know what is a food chain. A series of organisms, each dependent on the next as a source of food, is a food chain. The series of processes by which food is grown, produced, sold, and eventually consumed in a food chain. A food chain is a linear sequence of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass from one organism to another organism. Here in this picture, you can see the grass that is eaten by grasshopper. Grasshopper is eaten by frog, and frog is eaten by snake. The important point here is the arrow indicates the flow of energy. It means from here, energy transferring from plants to the deer, from deer to the lion, and from lion to the next soil. So you understood the concept of arrows. Arrows are basically shown here in the food chain that will show the flow of energy. Following are the examples of food chain that are based on different organisms. The first food chain is 3-linked food chain. There are corn that is eaten by rat. Rat is eaten by owl. And second food chain is 4-linked food chain. Carrots that is eaten by rabbit. Rabbit is eaten by fox, and fox is eaten by lion. The most common food chain is of a 5-linked food chain. Grass. Grass is eaten by grasshopper. Grasshopper is eaten by frog, and frog is eaten by snake. Here is the next food chain in which the flowers are eaten by caterpillar. Caterpillar is eaten by frog, and frog is eaten by snake, and then snake is eaten by owl. So these are the examples of food chain. Following are the components of food chain. The food chain consists of 4 main parts: the sun, which provides the energy for everything on the planet. Secondly, the producers, consumers, and decomposers, and they all are dependent on each other. Now, one by one, we will discuss what are producers, what are consumers, and what are decomposers with their example. In this diagram, you can see energy pyramid is shown. At the base of this, the producers, then herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. These 3 are the consumers, and then at last there are decomposers. First of all, we will study the producers. An organism that make its own food from the non-living material is the producers. Producers are autotrophs. as they make their food by their own self. A producer is also called autotrophy, uses energy to make food. For example, trees, grass, berries, nuts, algae, and phytoplanktons. They get their food and energy from the sun. They make their food through a process called photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, plant uses the energy from the sun, water, and they use the carbon dioxide to make their food, that is glucose. Second component is consumers. Organisms that eat producers and other organisms are called consumers. Within an ecological food chains, consumers are categorized into primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers are herbivore, secondary consumers are carnivores, and tertiary consumers are omnivores. Herbivores are those a consumer that eat plants only, for example, grasshoppers, dogs, cows, mice. And carnivores are consumers that eats animals, for example, frogs, lions, sharks. And omnivores, as we are humans, bears, and turtles, they eat plants and animals both. The third component of the food chain is decomposers. Decomposer is an organism that gets energy and nutrients by breaking down the remains of the other organism, as they are dependent on the organism and they digest them and they transfer nutrients back to the soil. They feed on the remains of the other animals, they are dead or decaying. Decomposers play an important role in ecosystem. By digesting dead matter, they put nutrients back into the soil, making them available to producers again. For example, mushrooms, earthworms, mold, tiny algae. Some bacteria and insects are also decomposers. Here is a food chain is shown. In it, the sun gives energy to the plant producers. Plant use energy from the sun and water. The plants are eaten by herbivores that are primary consumers, and herbivores are eaten by omnivores that are secondary consumers, and omnivores are eaten by carnivores that are tertiary consumer, and then tertiary consumers are eaten and digested by decomposers, and decomposers make them available nutrients to the soil so that plant can use it again. Here are different examples of food chains are shown. Each level in an food chain is called the trophic level. Here are some level: primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers. There are different examples you can see in this diagram. Grassland biome. Grass is eaten by grasshopper. Grasshopper is eaten by rat. Rat is eaten by snake, and snake is eaten by hawk. This is the grassland biome. In pond biome, algae is eaten by mosquito larva. Mosquito larva is eaten by dragonfly larva, and dragonfly larva is eaten by fish, and fish is eaten by raccoon. This is the pond biome food chain. In ocean biome, phytoplanktons are the primary producers, zooplanktons are the primary consumers, fishes are secondary consumers, seal is tertiary consumer, and white sharks that eat the seals are quaternary consumers. After understanding the concept of food chain, we will learn what are the food webs. A food web is the natural interconnection of food chains and a graphical representation of what eats what in an ecological community. Another name for food web is consumer resource system. So basically, the food web is a graphical model that shows us many food chains linked together to show the feeding relationship of organisms in ecosystem. Here you can see a food web is given here. In this, the leaves are eaten by caterpillar. Caterpillar is eaten by snake, and snake can be eaten by hawk or owl. The grass is eaten by caterpillar, by rabbit, and by grasshopper. The rabbits are eaten by hawk. The grasshopper is eaten by this sparrow, and this blue jay sparrow is eaten by owl. In this way, different food chains connected together to make a food web. In this diagram, you can see this is a complex network of different food chains that are connected together to make a food web. Now there is time for the class activity. Class activity will be conducted individually. Worksheets will be distributed to the students, and teacher will ask them to write their name and construct a food web by using arrows and name of organism. Your food web should include all the components of food chain as we have discussed previous. Students will draw and make a food web by the help of arrows and name of organisms. In this way, activity will be conducted individually. After 10 minutes, worksheet will be collected. Now it's time to recap. In recap, first part is the consolidation. The teacher will ask some questions that what is food chain, define food chain, what are the components of food chain. After these questions that are for consolidation of the students, teacher will summarize the topic. To summarize the topic, teacher will show a video that will be helpful for clearing the concepts.
All living things need energy in order to live, and they get this energy from the food they eat. All food chains start with plants and end with animals. Plants are called producers because they produce their own food from sunlight, water, and the nutrition that they get from the soil. Animals are called consumers because they cannot prepare their own food and are directly or indirectly dependent on plants for their energy. Some animals eat plants and some eat animals for energy. Animals that eat only plants to get energy are called herbivores. For example, deers, cows, grasshoppers. Animals that eat only animals to get energy are called carnivores. For example, tigers, lions, snakes. Animals that eat both plants and animals to get energy are called omnivores. For example, monkeys and bears. A simple food chain starts with grass, which is eaten by rabbits. Then the rabbits are eaten by foxes. A big food chain starts with acorns, which are eaten by mice. The mice are eaten by snakes. And then finally the snakes are eaten by foxes. At each link in the chain, energy is being transferred from one animal to another. Marine food chain. A marine food chain starts with phytoplankton, which are eaten by small fishes. A network of many food chains is called a food web.
In this food web that is very complex, the plant is eaten by the worms, by the grasshopper, and by this fly. And this fly is eaten by the bug, and the bug is eaten by the bird, and bird is eaten by the eagle. The worm is eaten by the rat, and grasshopper is also eaten by the rat and also by the bird. And rat is also eaten by the eagle. So this is a complex network of many food chains that together form a food web. So by this we can summarize the lesson. What is the food chain? A series of organisms, each dependent on the next as a source of food. The series of processes by which food is grown or produced, sold, and eventually consumed. Then we understand the concept of food chain. After that, food web. A food web is the natural interconnection of food chains and a graphical representation of what eats what in an ecological community. Another name for the food web is consumer resource system. There are following components of the food chain: the sun, which provides the energy for everything on the planet except organisms living near the hydrothermal vents, and producers, consumers, decomposers. A producer is also called autotrophs. They use energy to make food. They don't depend on others. The examples of producers that we have discussed are trees, grasses, berries, nuts, algae, and phytoplanktons. Then consumers. Within an ecological food chain, consumers are categorized into primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers are herbivores that feeding on the plants, for example, caterpillars, insects, grasshoppers, termites, and hummingbirds. All are examples of primary consumers. Secondary consumers that depend on primary consumers, and tertiary consumers are omnivores that eat both plants and animals. Decomposers is the last component of food chain. A decomposer is an organism that gets energy and nutrients by breaking down the remains of other organisms, for example, mushrooms, earthworms, mold, and tiny algae, some bacteria, and insects. In this way, the components are discussed in food chain with the help of examples and by a video. Here a simple food chain is shown in which the plant are producers that are eaten by the snail, that is primary consumer. Snail is eaten by the bird, that is secondary consumer, and the hawk, that is tertiary consumer. So you have seen this video. Announcement of next topic. Our next topic of discussion will be osmotic adjustment of plants. Homework. Solve the questions of exercise on your page 118. Describe and draw the food chain up to human beings by using pictures and arrows. The student will paint the pictures and properly use the arrows to make the food chain that involve human being at the end. In this way, today's lesson will be finished. If you have any question, you can ask. Thank you.